It's a great pleasure to introduce Andrew Snyder Beattie. So Andrew is the Director of Research at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. Before that, he worked as a project manager at the Future of Humanities Institute and as a researcher at MetaMed. Biotechnology and existential risk are important areas of the effective altruism community profile. So please join me in welcoming Andrew.
Right. Thanks, everyone. So my name is Andrew Snyder Beattie. I work at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. And today I'll be talking a little bit about biotechnology as kind of an emerging existential risk. So this is Lake Toba in Indonesia. 70,000 years ago, it was the location of a supervolcanic eruption that ejected some 2,500 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. This, in turn, led to a volcanic winter that was estimated to have lasted almost a decade. And although the archaeological evidence is still somewhat spotty, there's an ongoing academic debate, there's some evidence that indicates that the human population at the time suffered tremendously, potentially dropping to as few as a few thousand surviving individuals, which suggests that if this supervolcanic eruption were just slightly more powerful, none of us would be alive today, and the human story would have ended 70,000 years ago. So supervolcanoes are one example of an existential risk. And existential risk is something that could prematurely end the human story, and it's something that the Future of Humanity Institute spends a lot of time studying, both in terms of the scientific aspects of existential risk as well as the ethical aspects of existential risk. So I'll start today's talk with a just quick overview of the ethical aspects of existential risk. Many of you in the audience will already be familiar with these arguments. And then go on to some of the more scientific aspects of existential risk, specifically talking about biotechnology and the emerging risks caused by biotechnology to the future of humanity. OK, so first on the ethical or normative side. So there are a lot of different things that we potentially value, but for the assumption of this talk, I'm going to assume that we value human life. And not only that, but I think a typical effective altruist would agree that the value that we place on a human life should not depend on that person's location in space, right? So the value of our lives in a kind of more developed part of the world ought to be weighted intrinsically the same as those living in more impoverished parts of the world. So in other words, when we think about how we allocate our resources to do the most good, we shouldn't discriminate across space. A more interesting question is, should we then discriminate across time? And a growing body of philosophical literature and philosophical arguments have started making the case that in the same way that it's arbitrary to discriminate across space, it's also arbitrary to discriminate across time. So how should we think about lives that are living maybe 100 years or 1,000 years or maybe even 1,000,000 years in the future? And so this kind of thought experiment was really kind of done well by a philosopher, Derek Parfit, in his book Reasons and Persons, where he asks us to consider 3 different scenarios. OK, scenario 1 is that there's world peace. Everyone is living happy, healthy lives. Scenario 2 is that there is a terrible nuclear war that leaves 99% of humanity dead. And scenario 3 is that there's a terrible nuclear war that leaves 100% of humanity dead. Now, obviously, scenario 1 is the best scenario. Scenario 2 is the second worst scenario, and scenario 3 is the worst scenario. But Derek Parfit asks us to consider a different question, which is, what is the greater difference between these scenarios? Is there a bigger difference between scenario 1 and 2, or is there a bigger difference between scenarios 2 and 3? Now, if you're of the opinion that the only lives that we should include in our calculation are the humans that are currently living on Earth, then the difference between scenario 1 and 2 is much greater, 99% of the population as opposed to just 1% of the population. But if we think we should also include future lives and future generations into this calculation, the difference between scenario 2 and scenario 3 is actually far, far greater. We can do some kind of basic back-of-the-envelope calculations to get a sense of how much greater. So Earth is thought to remain habitable for another 1.1 billion years or so. Eventually, the sun will expand into a red giant and engulf the Earth's orbit, but until then, humans could potentially be living on Earth. And if we assume that there are only 1 billion people living on the planet for this period of time, and that each person lives for 100 years, we get 10 to the 16th, 10,000 trillion future human lives that could exist if we can avoid these existential risks. And what this then implies is that even reducing the risk of extinction by a very small amount, so 1/millionth of 1 percentage point, for example, is, in expectation, worth over tens of millions of lives. Now, this line of argument relies on a few things, taking the expectation as the thing we ought to be doing, or that, that we value these future human lives and we're not taking a person-affecting view or whatnot. But it suggests that kind of in the portfolio of things that effective altruists care about, existential risk should be certainly given serious consideration. So that's kind of the ethical overview of existential risk. I'm now going to talk about something that effective altruists are maybe less familiar with, which is some of the more scientific aspects of existential risk. So broadly speaking, you can divide existential risks into 2 categories. The first categories are things that are incredibly big. So things like nuclear war, novel weapons of mass destruction, supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, climate change, things that kind of jeopardize the habitability of the biosphere in a very big and sudden way. The second category of things are risks that end up self-replicating. So even though they don't start big, they end up becoming big over time. So examples of this include global pandemics or maybe engineered bioweapons, and potentially in the future advanced nanotechnology or artificial superintelligence. The focus of this talk will be on these first 2 categories, so natural pandemics and engineered bioweapons. So I'll start with natural pandemics. If we add up some of the greatest catastrophes in human history in terms of just the raw death toll, so the world wars, the Han Dynasty collapse, etc., and we compare these to various disease events throughout history, for example, smallpox, what we find is that smallpox in just 100 years ended up killing more people than all of these catastrophes combined. The 1918 Spanish flu, just a relatively short-lasting epidemic, killed more people than the First World War. So even setting aside the arguments about the future generations in the long-term future, reducing the risks of deadly pandemics could be a relatively cost-effective means of doing good. So for example, smallpox eradication, it's thought, only costed a few $100 million, and if it saved 100 years, 500 million lives, you're looking at an incredibly cost-effective way of doing good. But there are a few reasons why I think natural pandemics do not actually pose an existential risk. The first reason I don't think natural pandemics actually pose an existential risk is this argument about base rates of extinction. So the average mammalian species lasts for about 1 million years, and throughout recorded history, there's only actually been one instance of a mammalian species going extinct due to disease, which was a species of rat on a relatively isolated island. We can also kind of make the assumption that over the past 200,000 years, humanity has existed and not been subject to these big disease events that threatened the future of humanity. And so the probability that we go extinct in the next 100 or 200 years due to naturally occurring disease would be relatively small. And you can do some basic statistics on this, like Laplace's law of succession, to kind of put the bound on the risk as 1 in 400,000 or something along those lines. But basically the argument is human history, if we represent with this line, has already survived natural pandemics for that period of time. And that's the next century or two where we might be subject to advances in biotechnology that could either solve or exacerbate these pandemics. So the likelihood that we haven't gone extinct in that period of time but would go extinct in that period of time is relatively low. The second argument for why I think natural pandemics are not an existential risk comes from some ideas basically in ecology and evolution. And it's this concept known as optimal virulence. So with any pandemic, there are 2 main parameters that are important for determining the damage that a pandemic causes. The first is the case fatality ratio on the y-axis. And this represents the percent chance that you die if you get the disease, right? So if you get a disease, has a 60% case fatality ratio, then you have a 60% chance of dying, right? The second number on the x-axis is the reproduction number, sometimes in epidemiology known as R0. And this represents the number of people on average that get the disease for each new infection. So if I got a disease that had an R0 of 4, that means that on average I would spread it to 4 other people before I either recovered or died from the disease. So these are the 2 big numbers that kind of determine the extent of the damage of a pandemic. And if we plot various human diseases on this chart, what you'll notice is that there is an inverse relationship between these variables. So diseases that have very high case fatality ratios, such as Ebola or HIV/AIDS, have relatively low reproduction numbers. They kill people before they can spread like throughout the human population. Whereas diseases that have very high reproduction numbers, such as measles or whooping cough, have a very low case fatality ratio, something like 1 in 10,000 or even lower. And to some extent, this makes sense, because a disease is like any other parasite. A parasite doesn't actually want to kill its host too quickly. It's actually bad for its own survival. And so diseases, it's thought, actually evolve to become less lethal over time. And so this is one of the reasons I don't think a naturally occurring pandemic would necessarily get us all the way to an existential risk that actually creates human extinction. But a question is, with advances in biotechnology, could we break out of this relationship, right? This relationship is a byproduct of evolution. It's not an intrinsic law of physics or anything. So could we, for example, so this is smallpox. Smallpox has a relatively high reproduction number and a relatively high case fatality ratio. Could we potentially engineer smallpox so it had a case fatality ratio of 100%, killing absolutely everyone that got infected with it? The answer seems to be yes. In 2004, scientists were trying to make mice sterile with a version of Mousepox. And they modified this Mousepox version in order to try and get the mice to do what they were hoping to do. But they accidentally created a strain of Mousepox which actually had a 100% case fatality ratio, killed all of the mice that they tested it on. And not only that, but it also rendered the Mousepox vaccine ineffective. So this version of the Mousepox virus kind of overcame the vaccine. And then scientists examined what the scientists had done to this and concluded that it would be relatively straightforward to do the same thing for the human version of smallpox. So that's kind of scary. I should also note that the scientists published their methodology of how to do this in the open literature, so anyone kind of has access to this. But at least they weren't intentionally trying to create something that was potentially harmful for humans. Which is more than can be said of a number of other relatively dangerous experiments. So these were a number of experiments done on the H5N1 bird flu about 4 years ago. And H5N1 is a strain of bird flu that has a 60% case fatality ratio, so very, very deadly. If you get it, 60% chance you die. But the reason it's not super scary is that it's not airborne transmissible between humans. So if I were to get H5N1, it would probably be because I was working with poultry or got it from birds, but I couldn't then go on to spread it to other humans. So what these scientists wanted to figure out is, could you mutate the virus in order to get airborne transmissibility between mammals? And so they ended up conducting these studies, these two groups of researchers, one in Wisconsin-Madison, the other in the Netherlands. And they ended up successfully getting airborne transmissibility with the H5N1 virus between ferrets, which is typically the model used for humans. So if something's airborne transmissible between ferrets, it's usually airborne transmissible between humans and vice versa. And they were publishing this in Nature and Science. And this ended up creating a lot of stir in the biosecurity community, because obviously, if this were to create, if there was a laboratory accident and this pandemic accidentally got out of the laboratory, that could cause a lot of damage. So two epidemiologists actually looked at this. They said, okay, let's just do some back-of-the-envelope calculations, see how bad a laboratory accident might be for this. So 60% case fatality ratio. And flu, when it usually emerges, typically hits about 25% of the world population within 2 years of arrival. And if you just kind of naively crunch the numbers, you get over 1 billion deaths from one laboratory accident of this type. So this kind of split the flu community. There were a lot of people that felt that these experiments were far too dangerous and didn't justify the cost or the scientific value of the experiments. And they also pointed to historical examples of laboratory accidents leading to pandemics. So this is something not many people in the EA community are familiar with, but in 1977, there was a strain of H1N1 that circulated around the world. It originated in northern China. And when scientists looked at the strain of H1N1, what they found is that the 1977 flu strain was the exact same as the 1957 flu strain, which indicated that it wasn't circulating in a human population because viruses mutate quickly, and it would have been a different sequence. And it also wasn't circulating in an animal population because it also would have mutated. So the current theory is that it actually escaped from a Russian laboratory. It was a frozen sample of the 1957 flu strain that then escaped and caused basically this pandemic in 1977. So this is not unprecedented. This has happened before. So this is kind of one general category, laboratory accidents, that I think people should be giving a little bit more thought to. However, I think another scary trend in terms of biotechnology is that throughout history, countries have intentionally spent large sums of resources weaponizing biology. So in terms of World War I, World War II, the Cold War, all of the current wars between great powers, bioweapons were either used or developed. So the Soviets in particular had particularly interesting projects where they would try and combine the traits of smallpox and hemorrhagic fever, such as Ebola. And most of these efforts weren't very successful because the technology wasn't quite there, back in the 70s and 80s, for example. But it does indicate that countries, if they have an incentive to adopt kind of a mutually assured destruction policy, might have incentives to build incredibly nasty weapons if they think that it could lead to a better political outcome. And so preventing arms races between great powers with biotechnology, I think, should be one of the top priorities if we're interested in reducing existential risk. Another consideration is thinking about state-run bioweapons programs versus individual bioterrorists. So there are a lot of reasons to think one might be nastier than the other. So the state-run programs obviously have much better science, and they might be willing to kind of gamble with the end of the world if they think that it would lead to a better deterrence outcome. On the other hand, non-state bioterrorists, there might be a lot more of them, so there are not that many states that would be willing to openly or covertly develop bioweapons programs, whereas there might be many, many bioterrorists, for example. And also, they might have more intrinsically destructive goals in terms of bioterrorism. I think another interesting thing about bioterrorism and all terrorism in general is it tends to follow a power law distribution. So this means that if you plot the frequency and the severity of an attack, it basically looks linear on a log-log scale. And in plain English, what that means is that you're going to have lots of relatively small events, but occasionally you're going to get these really big outlier events. And the slope of the tail indicates how frequent these outlier events are. So for example, attacks with knives have a relatively steep slope. The outliers don't get that high. It's hard to kill lots and lots of people with a knife. Conversely, chemical and biological weapons have a power law curve which has a very, very shallow slope, indicating that outliers are actually reasonably common. Now, there are a couple of things about the power law in addition to outliers. One is that, if you're interested in saving the largest number of expected lives, even, again, setting aside the future generations consideration, the fact that it's such a heavy-tailed distribution means that you're better off focusing on the worst-case scenarios because the scale is highly nonlinear. So, for example, 9/11 killed over 100 times as many people, or over 50 times as many people as all other terrorist incidents added up in the United States over the next 10 years, which suggests that if you're national security and you're trying to save, the most expected lives from terrorists, you're actually better off with a 2% chance of reducing the next 9/11 than a 100% chance of reducing the risk, 100% chance of solving all the other terrorist attacks in the decade combined. So if you're interested in reducing these risks, you actually are better off focusing on the worst case scenarios, even setting aside the considerations about future generations. In this particular instance, this outlier here is a particularly interesting story. The reason that outlier is an interesting story is it came from a Japanese doomsday cult known as Shinrikyo. And this is interesting because Shinrikyo had the very explicit goal of instigating human extinction. They were actually trying to create a human extinction event. And they had a relatively sophisticated chemical and biological weapons program in the 90s. So they had a PhD person in the biosciences working for them. They had a relatively healthy financial situation. They managed to procure things like VX nerve gas. They managed to procure a Soviet helicopter that they were planning to use in a bio attack. And they traveled to various parts of Africa to try and obtain samples of Ebola. Now, their chemical weapons attack was relatively successful. It injured over 5,000 people on the Tokyo subway in 1995. Fortunately, their biological weapons program actually failed quite miserably. But the question is, that was in 1995, and what could a similar kind of doomsday cult do in the future? One of the worrying developments is that in a sub-branch of synthetic biology known as DNA synthesis. And this is basically a set of technologies that enable someone to take digital genetic code and then kind of print out DNA sequences. And people have used DNA synthesizers to, from scratch, build the polio virus. Just this year, a postdoc with less than $100,000 managed to synthesize a horsepox genome and a fully functioning horsepox virus from one of these machines. And so the thought is, right now, it's still pretty difficult to use one of these machines. It can print out like 200 base pairs or something like that, and then you have to paste these base pairs together. So it's not like you can just hit print and then print out a functioning virus. But as the technology gets better and better, we may be entering an era in which the barriers to entry for this kind of technology are reduced. And you might be saying, well, it's all fine and good to have DNA synthesizers. It's not like the smallpox genome is just lying around on the internet for anyone to get, except for the fact that it is. It takes maybe a few minutes of Googling to get the smallpox genome. So this is it. And one question is so it could be that this is actually good because it enables researchers to build countermeasures to smallpox and encourages the research community. But it doesn't seem like there's been much strategic thought in terms of what information we ought to be spreading and how this offense-defense balance trades off. So in addition to single events, I think one of the kind of existential risks that FHI worries about is this class of scenarios that kind of fall into this fragile world hypothesis, such that for some given level of technology, it might be that offense strongly dominates defense, and that even if there are 10,000 people working to provide a countermeasure, it only takes one person to build something nasty enough to overcome that countermeasure. And so these are some interesting research questions that we haven't yet settled. So, does offense and biotechnology beat defense in the long run? And what are the technical and policy countermeasures to this? And in what worlds would we end up being safe? There are a few things that we can robustly recommend. So obviously, we should be reducing the probability of arms races between countries that might want to weaponize biotechnology. Obviously, various things like platform diagnostics or template vaccines that can apply to a wide variety of different biothreats would be better to develop and develop relatively quickly. And we can also say with more certainty that more high-level strategy thinking around these questions is also needed. It's still a relatively embryonic field compared to things like AI safety. OK, so with that, I will briefly say if you're an EA and you're interested in this space, I'd highly recommend chatting with me or Greg Lewis, who's over there. We'll be having office hours at 3 o'clock, so come chat with us about careers in this space. I'm really excited about research and policy government careers. I'm actually less excited about technical countermeasures, so like physically building vaccines or whatnot, and be happy to talk more about that. The other thing I want to make a pitch for is operations talent. So this is something that most of the X-risk organizations are highly constrained by. And so if you have operations talent, you should go to Tanya Singh's talk and think about what you can do to potentially contribute to the field in that space in terms of reducing existential risk. So thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions.
So thanks very much, Andrew, as always, cheery.
Try,
yeah. So I've got a few questions here, but if you want to submit, we're also still taking questions. So firstly, it seems like a very compelling issue to focus on. Are there any centralized initiatives working on global preparedness for something like this?
Yes, certainly. So, but most of these are initiatives that are kind of in more conventional terms. So, obviously, the WHO, for example, is responsible for lots of these things, and then various national governments will have, initiatives, devoted to reducing the risk of pandemics. But most of these are focused on relatively mundane pandemics. So I don't think we'd necessarily be prepared for something like this, where you might have an intentional adversary that's trying to thwart, the countermeasures, or intentionally design the pathogen to overcome things like vaccination or quarantine or whatnot. So.
Okay, great. So what are your thoughts on overpopulation as a potential X-risk?
I tend to be quite skeptical that overpopulation would be an existential risk. My intuition is just that, I would need to know more about what that person is thinking in terms of the actual mechanism of overpopulation leading to extinction, whether or not it's like through war, terrorism, or resource shortages or something like that. But generally, I'm quite skeptical of that.
Yeah, I mean, population ethics, not something for a 5-minute Q&A, probably. So what are the most important research goals in this area, do you think?
Sure. So I think there are a few super important ones. One is just identifying what the biggest risks are. Like, should we be worried more about state arms races? Should we be worried more about this kind of fragile world hypothesis? So identifying the biggest risks and thinking through the countermeasures that would be needed for that. Other things I think we need a better sense of are like the offense-defense balance of information. So obviously this is an area in which information hazards are quite prevalent. So there are like lots of things that might not be good to spread widely. And so thinking through building heuristics in order to determine whether or not a particular risk should be, one should be shouting from the rooftops, hey, this is a risk, you should pay attention to it, versus just taking it to groups that can kind of do actionable things with it. That would be like another set of research, priorities that I'd want to look at. General kind of horizon scanning, so like, what are the advances that we're going to see in biotechnology in the future? How quickly and rapidly are these advances going to happen? And then what concretely does that translate into in terms of an adversary, like trying to use it for malicious purposes?
Okay, great, thanks. And so I know you spoke a bit at the start about pandemics in terms of natural pandemics happening and the understanding the probabilities around those, but how likely is sort of maybe extinction from pandemics sort of in the next 100 years outside of that?
Yeah, so good question. So we recently published a paper where we had 3 different models of this. I think all of the models are completely wrong, but I'll share the results anyway. So one was just a survey where we had a conference on global catastrophic risk, and we just asked everyone, what do you think the probability is that an engineered pandemic will lead to human extinction in the next 100 years? That was 2%. So 2% chance this century of extinction from a global pandemic. The next thing we did is we just took that Powerlaw distribution and we extrapolated it out all the way to 5 billion deaths. And then we divided that by 10, just saying for every event that leads to 5 billion deaths, we assume that 1 in 10 of those events leads to human extinction. That gave us a number about 10 to the negative 6 or 10 to the negative 7th per year of human extinction from biotech. The problem with that model is that it's relying on historical data, which is terrible. So like obviously there's not much track record of bioterrorism, and this could change dramatically if this kind of becomes the standard thing that terrorists use in the future. And as we see with like the car attacks, for example, these things can change relatively rapidly. Once something becomes popular, like people can kind of end up flocking to it. The third model we used was basically based on the laboratory accident data. So we assumed that for every lab accident that then leads to over 5 billion deaths, that also has a 10% chance, and that gets you numbers around 10 to the negative 8th. And that model is nice because it provides like a lower bound. Like that's the risk that we're currently facing right now because these experiments are ongoing right now. And so that seems like a reasonable lower bound, even if we take technology constant.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much. Can you join me in thanking Andrew for sharing with us today?